28th, so Napoleon, who was rather better than on the preceding day, had some conversation about Chateaubriand. Chateaubriand, said he, is an old emigrant who was appointed secretary to Cardinal Fesch when the latter was ambassador to the court of Rome, where he contrived to render himself disliked by the Pope and the cardinals, notwithstanding the Gallimatías, which he had published upon Christianity. While he was there, he endeavored to persuade the old king of Sardinia, who had abdicated and turned religioso, to renew his claim to the throne of Sardinia. The king, suspecting him to be a mouton, le mit à la porte, a sheep, sent him to the port and made him a complaint to me of his conduct, which caused his disgrace. While I was in power, he was one of the most abject of my flatterers. C'est un fanfaron sans caractère qui a l'âme rampante et qui a la fureur de faire des livres. He had no character, and he had a rampant soul, and he had a fury to make books. I asked some questions about Bernadotte's conduct. Bernadette said he was ungrateful to me as I was the author of his greatness, but I cannot say he betrayed me. He, in a manner, became a Swede and never promised that which he did not intend to perform. I can accuse him of ingratitude, but not of treachery. Neither Murat nor he would have declared against me had they thought it would have lost me my throne. The wish was to diminish my power, but not to destroy me altogether. Murat's bravery was so great that the Cossacks used to express their admiration of him with cries. They could not restrain their feelings at seeing a noble figure advancing like a knight of old and performing such prodigies of valor. Le Baudoyer, said he, was a young man animated by the noblest sentiments and the most sovereign contempt for a race that had surrounded themselves with all that was most foreign to the manners and rights of the French, and with a set of miserables, who, to avoid starvation, had vegetated for 25 years in inferior and disgraceful situations. His attachment to me was enthusiastic, and he declared himself at the moment of the greatest danger. Drouot he described to be one of the most virtuous and unassuming characters in France, though possessed of talent rarely to be met with. Drouot was a man who would live as contentedly, as far as regarded himself personally, upon 40 sous a day as if he had the revenues of a sovereign. He was charitable and religious, and a man whose morals, probity, and simplicity would have been honored in an age of stern republicanism. 30th, went to Plantation House. After some questions relative to Napoleon's state of health, Sir Hudson Lowe said that he had heard in an indirect manner, which it was not necessary for him to explain to me, that General Bonaparte was in a much worse state of health than I had reported him to be, that he desired, therefore, whenever I went to town, that I would mention to Mr. Baxter or Sir Thomas Reed the state of his health, which might prevent the necessity of my coming to Plantation House to report on the day I made them, that I might now mention to Major Goriker what I had to say about his health. Accordingly, I told the Major that since the 26th, Napoleon had not suffered so much from headache, especially in the right side of the head, as I had extracted the tooth from that jaw, that the swelling in his cheek was considerably less, that his bowels were very costive, that he had some symptoms of dyspepsia, such as nausea, that the pain in his side was not increased, nor were his legs diminished in size, that on the whole, though the complaint his cheek was better, there was no amelioration in his general state of health. I also applied for a small still or alembic in order to make some orange flower water, as there was some to be had on the island, which to Napoleon would have been very grateful, and indeed necessary. February 3rd, the Cambridge store ship arrived, bringing the melancholy news of the death of their Princess Charlotte. Communicated this intelligence to Napoleon, who expressed his affliction at the unfortunate event as independent of the feelings which naturally arose at the fate of a princess cut off in the prime of youth and beauty, And with such prospects before her, he said that he had not been without hopes that she would have caused more liberal policy to be adopted towards himself. He inveighed against the accoucheurs and expressed his surprise that the populace had not stoned them to death. He observed that the business had a strange appearance, and that precautions appeared to have been taken to deprive the princess of everything necessary to support and to console her in the first accouchement. He urged that some old married women who had frequently borne children ought to have been at her bedside to comfort her. Had they been present, they would have perceived that matters were going on wrong, and would have insisted upon further assistance being rendered. It was unpardonable in the old queen not to have been on the spot. What signified, Leopold, said he. He is a garçon, and knew not what to do. Had it not been for me, added he, Marie-Louise would have died in a similar manner. During the time of her labor, I was in an apartment close by, from whence I went to her room every now and then. After she had been some hours in labor, Dubois, the accoucheur, came to me while I was reclining on the sofa, with great alarm painted on his countenance, and said that the Empress was in a state of great danger, that there was a wrong presentation. I asked him if he had ever seen anything of the kind before. Dubois replied that he had, but very rarely, perhaps not 1 in 1,000, and that it was very afflicting to him that so extraordinary a case should happen with the Empress. Forget, said I, that she's an empress, and treat her as you would the wife of a little shopkeeper in the Rue Saint-Denis. This is the only favor I ask of you. Dubois then asked if it were necessary that one should be sacrificed. Which should he save, the mother or the child? The mother, certainly, I replied. It is her right. I then accompanied Dubois to the bedside, encouraged and tranquilized the Empress as much as possible, and held her while the forceps were applied. The child was apparently dead when born, but by frictions and other means he was restored to life. His birth produced a delirium of joy in the nation. On the discharge of the first gun that announced the interesting event, all the population of Paris, in the greatest suspense, ran into the streets, the public walks, and the parks, counting the number of guns. 21 guns were to have been fired for the birth of a princess, and 101 for a prince. At the discharge of the 22nd gun, the Parisians rent the skies with acclamations and expressions of universal delight. Almost all the powers of Europe sent ambassadors extraordinary to compliment me on the happy event. The Emperor of Austria was represented as his godfather by his brother, the Duke of Würzburg, and the Emperor Alexander sent his minister for the Home Department to Paris to express his satisfaction on the occasion. Had the poor Princess Charlotte, added he, had some person about her who would have acted with energy as I did, she would have been saved. Now, through the neglect of her relations and the imbecility, or something worse, of those miserables of accoucheurs, it is impossible to say what calamities may befall the British Empire. No sooner was it known, continued Napoleon, that the interests of France had induced me to dissolve the ties of my marriage, than the greatest sovereigns of Europe intrigued for an alliance with me. As soon as the Emperor of Austria heard that a new marriage was in agitation, he sent for Narbonne and expressed his surprise that his family had not been thought of. At this time, a union with a princess of Russia or of Saxony was contemplated. The cabinet of Vienna sent instructions on the subject to Prince Schwarzenberg, who was ambassador in Paris. Dispatches were also received from the ambassador in Russia stating the willingness of the Emperor Alexander to offer his sister, the Grand Duchess Anne. Some difficulties, however, presented themselves relative to the demand that the chapel for the Greek ritual should be established in the Tuileries. A privy council was held upon this subject, and the votes of the majority were for an Austrian princess. I consequently authorized Prince Eugene to make the overture to Prince Schwarzenberg, and articles of marriage similar to those between Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were signed. The Emperor Alexander was not pleased that his overtures were slighted, and thought that he had been deceived, and that 2 negotiations had been carried on at the same time, in which he was mistaken. It has been said, added Napoleon, that the marriage of Marie-Louise was one of the secret articles of the Treaty of Vienna, which had taken place some months before. This is entirely false. There was no thought whatever of an alliance with Austria previous to the dispatch from Narbonne. relating the hints which had been made to him by the Emperor Francis by Metternich. In fact, the marriage with the Empress Marie Louise was proposed in council, discussed, decided, and signed within 24 hours, which can be proved by many members of the council who are now in existence. Several were of opinion that I ought to have espoused a French woman, and the arguments in favor of this were so strong as to incline me to balance for a moment. It was hinted, however, by the court of Austria that declining to choose a princess out of one of the reigning houses of Europe would be a tacit declaration of intentions to overturn them whenever opportunities should present themselves. 10th. No improvement had taken place in Napoleon's health. Had some conversation with him relative to the marriage of Princess Elizabeth with the Prince of Hesse-Hamburg. The English royal family, said he, va in canagliarsi with little petty princes, to whom I would not have given a brevet of sous-lieutenant. When I marched upon Ulm in 1805, I passed through Stuttgart with my army, where I saw your Princess Royale, the Queen of Württemberg, with whom I had several conversations and was much pleased with her. She soon lost whatever prejudices she might have originally entertained against me. I had the pleasure of interfering to her advantage when her husband, who was brute, though a man of talent, had ill-treated her, for which she was very grateful to me. She afterwards contributed materially towards effecting the marriage between my brother Jerome and the Princess Catherine, daughter of the king, by a former marriage. 16th. While in Jamestown, I was asked by Mr. Barber of the Cambridge, who had opened his shop in town, how did Bonaparte like the portraits? Being ignorant of his meaning, I asked for explanations. He said that I surely must know what he alluded to, and after some more conversation informed me that he had brought out 2 engravings of young Napoleon for sale, thinking that it would please the French, and induced them to give him some custom, that on his arrival he had mentioned the circumstance, and that both of the portraits had been taken by the governor and Sir Thomas Reed. Sir Hudson Lowe declaring that he was glad to have an opportunity of sending such articles to Bonaparte. Mr. Barber appeared much surprised and disappointed when he learned from me that they had not reached Longwood,